coverage of a forum on the economy. And at noon, live coverage of the U.S. Senate. Now a debate among the candidates running for Senate in Delaware. Tonight we'll hear from the incumbent Democratic candidate Joe Biden, Republican candidate Ray Clatworthy, and the Libertarian Party candidate Mark Jones. The one-hour debate is sponsored by WHYY-TV in Philadelphia.
Well, now that we have reset our roundtable, we're going to move on to the issues in the race for the United States Senate, the seat currently held by Democrat Joe Biden. And joining us this evening for that discussion at our table is the Republican candidate Ray Clatworthy and also the Libertarian candidate Mark Jones. Thank you to each for being here. Our journalists from our first half of the program have stayed with us. Nancy Kessler from the News Journal, believe it or not, they didn't leave, and Jim Osman of WILM. We're going to continue then with the same format, and that is our candidates will introduce themselves for about 2 minutes, and then we're going to have full conversation of the issues as presented by our journalists here with us. Candidates are allowed to exchange, they're allowed to interrupt each other, they are allowed to make sure that the issues are addressed to their liking. So we're going to get started. Joe Biden, you were the first one to receive the nod to start out with the introductions for this part of the program.
Well, thank you, Nancy, and thank you both for remaining for the Senate candidates. You know, I think this is an exciting time to be a senator, to run for the United States Senator. For the United States Senate, because the next 4 to 6 years, I think, are going to determine what this country is going to look like for the next 20 to 25 years. And it seems to me that there's some real basic choices we have to make. One is you're going to move on into the future. We're going to look for answers from the past. And that's kind of the way this debate is unfolding nationally. And it seems to me that we've done some pretty good things. It's taken a long time, but I got my crime bill passed. We're putting 100,000 more cops in the street. We're going to spend $9 billion in new prisons, 200,000 new prison beds, boot camps. The violence against women legislation is starting to make a difference in women's lives. We've actually reduced the federal deficit. I proposed freezing the federal budget in 1984. We've finally done it in 1995. We are moving very close to, we're with one vote of getting a constitutional amendment to balance the budget. And we've dismantled nuclear weapons, and we finally had a historic signing of the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. And, but this was only done when the extremes of both parties were set aside and we found a middle ground in which to be able to reach some accommodation to move forward. And it seems to me now it's time to continue to move forward and not move back. Not go back and repeal the assault weapons ban, not go back and get rid of the crime bill, not decide that what we want to do is gut education or cut out the money we spend for colleges. And so it seems to me that where we are now is we're going to have to make some fundamental judgments about Medicare, Medicaid, about crime, about Social Security, and from my perspective, the way to do it is to move on from where we are rather than decide to repeal what we've done.
And following that introduction, I'm going to turn it over to Mark Jones to give you your time to introduce yourself to our viewers.
Thank you. My name is Mark Jones, and I'm running for U.S. Senate because America is in deep trouble. And the two old parties in Washington who made this mess should be humble enough to listen to voices of change. The U.S. Constitution defines a very limited federal government, yet today's federal government greatly exceeds those limits, and it does so at our expense. Almost half the hours that we work, we are not working for ourselves, but we are working to pay taxes. And the federal government spends even more money than it takes from us in taxes. And deficit spending is immoral. It is fiscal child abuse. I fundamentally disagree with the two old parties in Washington. They expect a federal government that cannot even balance a budget to somehow miraculously have better luck with much more subtle problems. The war on poverty failed, the first prohibition failed, and so has the second. Every major study indicates that when we treat vices as felony crimes, we roll out the red carpet for organized crime. We may disagree over what solutions are needed, but we all live in fear of this increased violence, and we're all frustrated with the failure of federal crime policy. The answer lies in the U.S. Constitution. At the 10th Amendment, it says, leave it up to the states. Delaware is not the same as California or Arkansas, and we can never expect policies to work when they are one size fits all and mandated by a federal government that's so flawed that it cannot even balance a budget. With 50 states free to pursue different options, we will find solutions to these problems. We will have safe streets and a bright 21st century. Please, whatever you do, don't vote for the parties that made this mess by shifting all of the power to Washington. Invest your vote in the Libertarian Party. When you vote Libertarian, you send a loud and clear message that you want real change now.
I'd like to invite now Ray Clatworthy, the Republican candidate, to introduce himself.
Thank you, Nancy. I appreciate that very much. I am Ray Clatworthy. I'm a candidate for the U.S. Senate, and I'm a small business person. I got into this race because this is frankly not the same country I grew up in, and it's evident. I'm concerned about my children, what kind of America my children will inherit. And when you look at the facts state this, that violent crime has gone up 500% in the last 30 years in America. Our schools no longer function like they once did, and our tax structure now is so oppressive that families require multiple jobs in order to be able to take care of family needs, and families have very little time for each other anymore. I recently completed something called the First State Tour, where I got out amongst Delawareans across the breadth and length of the state of Delaware, and they are concerned just as I am. And they don't want a government that has had unfettered growth to continue in that posture. They're very concerned about the tax and spend policies that we've experienced over the last 24 to 30 years. And, you know, one interesting thing I found out is very few people understood the voting record of the Democratic incumbent. Very few people understood that he cast the deciding vote for the single biggest tax increase in history in 1993. They didn't understand that he voted to increase Social Security taxes on our elderly while he gave himself a real large pay increase. They didn't understand that he voted himself a $3.4 million pension, nor that he was the single biggest spender in the U.S. Senate during this last term of office, and that the Citizens Against Government Waste characterized him as hostile to the American taxpayer. So Joe says that Ray doesn't want to talk about the issues, but Senator, with all due respect, your voting record really is the issue, and you owe it to Delaware to discuss your voting record.
I think then, if you both would agree with me, that we should just proceed from that point on. I think that's a sounding board for us to continue the conversation. We'll allow Senator Biden to respond to that, and then I'll put both of you on the hot seat.
Well, look, Ray takes interesting things in interesting context. For example, on the Social Security tax. The real vote on Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid was the issue of whether or not we were going to cut by $475 billion Medicare and Medicaid. Ray's proposal is that he wants to go out and privatize Social Security, as I understand it, which fundamentally changes the Social Security system that we have it. I think that's what you said, privatize. Isn't that what you said?
No, you've used that word in your brochure, Joe. What I have said is this. We have a covenant with the elderly in America. I want to keep that covenant. Today, currently, we've had a raid on the Social Security Trust Fund. Yeah. There isn't any dollars in the Social Security Trust Fund. There are only IOUs. Now, we've got to retain that covenant with our elderly.
Can we privatize?
But now, listen, please hear me through so I can be clear so you'll fully understand my position, Joe. Not only do we have to retain that covenant, but we also have to be able to provide for younger people who are coming along.
Speaking go ahead.
I want to see our younger people be able to fully fund the Social Security Trust Fund, but I also want to see them start to be able to retain some of their dollars to personally invest it and to retain some kinds of earnings, unlike that they're projected to get
this money?
Today.
How about all of it?
Well,
let me speak to this before I get locked out.
I need to allow this to continue because he was responding to something the senator had begun, and I'd like to see
that. But that sounds like, what does that mean, Ray? Does it mean you privatize the system?
Well, let me say this, Senator, that right now, more people who are in their 20s, 30s, and 40s believe that the prospects of seeing a flying saucer are better than getting any money out of the Social Security Trust.
My question.
Yes, I'm getting to the answer.
I'm sorry.
Yes, sir. And what will happen is this. In Chile, in 1980, their system faced insolvency, much like our system faces insolvency. They switched over to a system where they kept the covenant with the elderly. The younger people were able to retain a very small portion.
What does that mean?
I'm telling you, if you'll follow me, you'll find in a moment.
I'm trying to.
Okay. The younger people were able to retain a certain portion, very small in the beginning, but as the older people died, each year they're able to retain a little more. So the older people kept their covenant.
So you do away with the Social Security system?
No, I would not do away with it, but it would allow people to be able to do some private investing, some self-investing.
I see. Well, you know, ironically, we have a vast disagreement, as you can tell, on that issue. And I'd
Not
like
as
to discuss
vast
it.
as you have with me. You two sound identical from where I sit. I don't trust politicians with our money. Look what they've done with the Social Security system, with all due respect to your parties. It's a mess. It's busted.
Well, you know,
the libertarian solution is a
it is
real
not
simple
busted.
one.
No, by the way, it is not busted.
Well, from where I sit as a 31-year-old, I am being ripped off, period.
Let's get the facts straight. A, it is not busted. No one has suggested there's any difficulty with the Social Security system and the solvency and the well of the next century. Well, you're wrong. Now, with regard to your second point about the National Taxpayers Union vote, I have been essentially voted in the 30 to so senators every year since I've been there, been voted as, from the National Taxpayers Union perspective, bigger spenders than I have. The year that he picks as me being picked as the biggest spender, you know why I was picked as the biggest spender? Because I wanted to take Social Security off budget. Moynihan and I had an amendment that passed, said you could not spend that money, you could not count that money. And guess what? The Republican Party said no, they wanted it in the budget.
And as long as it's political football, it's going to be a mess.
Okay, but let's let the point continue.
But the larger point here is, the debate is about Social Security, not a phony question about whether or not in 1 year, and he gets the year wrong, he says 1995 was 1994, the Taxpayers Union categorized me that way. And the reason for that was, in that year, I, along with Harry Reid of Nevada, tried to move Social Security out of consideration of the balanced budget. It has a surplus now. I want that surplus for Social Security placed aside for only Social Security. Republicans don't want that. They insisted it be counted in the budget so that it would make the deficit look lower. So I got nailed for being a spender because it raised the deficit when I took Social Security and put it aside, number one. Number two, the Biden crime bill, which does not cost a single penny.
Yeah, am I going to be able to address
to the crime
No, I'm not switching. I'm answering the question.
Okay,
and I still haven't been able to explain the simple solution to Social Security.
Let me, this is the last thing I'll say. The point about why I was rated in '94 as a big spender, go back and look at it. I was rated because I wanted to move Social Security off budget and because I passed the Biden crime bill, which they said was something shouldn't be done. And they took both those items and that put me in. Otherwise, if you look at every other year, I am in the middle of what people talk about.
I think that what's
wait a
best
minute.
for us to do at this point.
In the interest of accuracy, Nancy, that has to be responded to. Senator Biden has, with great frequency, ended up in the top 10 within, as the biggest spender in the U.S. Within the top 10. Now, Senator Biden, in an election year, is attempting to portray himself as a conservative. Now, don't take my word for it. Let's take a look at a couple independent bodies. The American Conservative Union, for instance, has, well, they do. They don't care if you're Democratic or independent, or they don't. All they care about what kind of voting are. They have you somewhere between a 0 and 70. Well, may I?
Sure,
I didn't interrupt you. Now, somewhere between 0 and 17% with a lifetime rating of 17%.
The American Conservative Union, right?
Yes. Now, the ADA, Americans for Democratic Action, a very liberal organization, has you ranked in the 95th percentile last year. They both seem to agree with you. They have you rated in liberalism.
Spending, right?
No, last year.
Okay.
So
you're mixing your apples and oranges
again,
I'm
right?
not.
No, I'm not, because big spending generally goes with liberalism.
Who's the guy that offered the proposal in '84 to balance the budget by freezing the federal budget? Who's the guy in the mid-'80s
who voted against the balanced budget amendment 6 times since 1982? He's looking me in the eye at this moment.
The guy who voted for the balanced budget amendment, the right balanced budget amendment, it's the same one that Bill Roth and Mike Castle voted for the last 2 times we had it up. I voted against other balanced budget amendments because I didn't think they worked. That's the reason I voted against. I picked the ones that I thought would work and voted against the ones that wouldn't.
I'm going to seize the opportunity here. Well, we could go back and forth, though. I think that we need to recognize that we're under 30 minutes, and we want to make sure that we've brought in some other issues to this. I think we understand the format at this point.
I have 20 seconds to touch Social Security.
It probably will come back to you. I guarantee it. Let's let Nancy Kessler chime in at this point and direct our conversation.
Well, this is a trick question. I want to ask you a philosophical question. The question of how big government should be is part of this campaign. If you look at, each of you, the founders of the country and the people who wrote our Constitution, I would like for each of you to tell us which one you most admire And what about his philosophies do you admire the most?
Thomas Jefferson. He did not trust government. He would have predicted all of the failures that we see today. He would have predicted that if you have something like Social Security and turn it over to politicians, guess what? It runs into a serious mess. Maybe it isn't busted, although I know that I'm getting ripped off, and I know anyone close to my age is. He didn't trust government with anything. Whenever it came to something like the drug war, which Senator Biden is famous for, Thomas Jefferson and George Washington both grew hemp. And today, you would be thrown in jail for doing that. He recognized that government was at best a necessary evil, and when you look at the Constitution, it says that all that the federal government should be involved in is national defense and courts, and very little else. This idea of somehow people voting themselves money is a seduction where career politicians can buy votes from people, but then guess what? We get into the year 2000, and people my age have to be taxed at a 70% level to pay the interest on the debt. I'm running because I'm very upset about this, and I want my country back. I want our civil liberties protected.
Mr. Clatworthy answer Nancy Kessler's
Well,
question.
certainly George Washington was a great hero. I'm not sure he had the greatest intellect of the founding fathers, but his strength of character carried us through the Revolution, no question about it. John Adams, our second president, who understood fully when he said that our Constitution is incapable of governing any other than a moral and religious people. And we see that today. We see that with clarity. Jefferson, obviously, because of his decentralization of power. But we had the collective wisdom of, and obviously our fourth president, James Madison, and his contribution to our Constitution. But we had the collective wisdom of statesmen at that point in time. Today, quite often, things are very, very different. Today, it seems that we have something called the career professional politician that is far from the citizen legislator model that our founding fathers believed in. And today, people are so much more interested in the next election than in the next generation. And that's what we've got to get back to. We need to have citizen legislators.
Nancy, coincidentally, the people that they both named were all career politicians. They spent their entire lives in politics.
You should not say that about these men. They were revolutionaries.
No, they were revolutionaries.
They cared about the posterity.
Let's let the senator answer.
George Washington could have made himself king.
He didn't.
And serve as long as he would have liked to.
I need to ask both of you. We allowed you both to have your opportunity to answer the question.
He was insulting my hero.
I'm not insulting you. He's the founder of my party. I'm a Democrat because of guys like Thomas Jefferson. Now, the people that I admire the most, I suspect, first are Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln engaged in something that only government could do. He decided that he'd end the atrocity of slavery in the United States of America. And he was an interventionist on the most single significant moral issue of our time. I believe that Franklin Roosevelt was a great president. These guys probably think he was a communist, but I think he was a great president. He engaged in having the nation move forward at a time when obviously the private sector was not able to do it, and the private sector needed help. I think that Dwight Eisenhower is probably the most unsung hero of our time as President of the United States of America. Dwight Eisenhower came up with the national highway system. Dwight Eisenhower was the one who pushed forward and made sure we had the GI Bill, which intervened to get people into college, where government provided a platform for people to move forward. And but there are a number of great presidents.
Well, before you go any further, the question really was founding fathers. Can we have a founding father here?
Oh, well, I think in terms of the founding fathers, probably the most significant was Thomas Jefferson. And I suspect maybe very shortly after him was George Washington, who, by the way, whose intellect was vastly underrated in terms of how bright he was and his ability to bring a nation together. There were many, many people, and I suspect those two people were probably the most significant.
Well, now, he uses Thomas Jefferson to indicate that it should be a very restricted federal government based on what he said. Do you agree with that?
I agree with Thomas Jefferson, by the way. Remember what the deal was. Thomas Jefferson was an anti-federalist at a time when what was happening was a desire on the part of New York and other big states to take control of the whole nation. That's what that was about, that fight was about. But Thomas Jefferson also believed that there was an obligation to help people who did not have any other alternative. And, you know, I mean, we can debate the life of Thomas Jefferson, but the bottom line here, it seems to me, is what is the role of government? For example, should the government be involved in promoting a system that, in fact, provides for security of the elderly in America? Should there be Medicare?
If it worked, maybe.
Well,
maybe if it worked.
Well,
but it doesn't.
But I assume
government doesn't work.
You just said nothing government does work. That's what you said.
National defense is excellent. Anything in the Constitution.
Okay, so there should be no Medicare, I assume.
What we need to do.
Would you wipe out Medicare?
Yes. I mean, right now it's failed. Right. The average Medicare recipient pays more out of pocket today than before Medicare was begun because
that isn't okay. Well, anyway,
central planning does not work.
Do you think we should eliminate Medicare?
No, I do not. I want to preserve it, and I think the way you preserve Medicare and Medicaid is not by sending politicians that are trying to play political football to gain some kind of advantage for an election cycle. You know, my mom is 75, my stepfather is 81. I want to preserve it for them. There's no question about that.
What would you do?
Well, first you have to threshold problem is to understand there is a problem. You have to recognize that the Medicare Trust Committee said that it would be insolvent by the year 2002. While we were playing political football, it is now being reassessed as being insolvent in the year 2001. We need to do several things. First, we have to bring some market-based efficiencies to Medicare. We need to bring some choices. You have voted against medical savings account with some frequency. That is a way to bring some market-based efficiency. We need to bring the kinds of choices that are federal.
Has nothing to do with Medicare.
It can be one of the. It can be one of the programs. I believe that. Please hear me out. You asked a question. I want to respond to it. It's important to first be able to keep, once again, the covenant with our elderly. If they want to be able to keep the existing system, I want them to keep that system. I don't want to frighten 85-year-olds. That was part of the political discourse during the last year.
They will be frightened as long as we let politicians hold it.
Let me continue. Then we have to be able to allow as many choices. The federal workers in program with a lot of choices brings choice and competition to the process. Medical savings account can bring some market-based efficiencies to government. HMOs with those people who care to have them. So we need to understand that when you bring choices, then you bring buying discipline. When people can save some dollars that they can spend, if they spend dollars effectively and they can save the residue, it becomes a better system. We can also identify waste, fraud, and abuse. When I go before seniors and I ask them, how many of you seen any waste, fraud, or abuse in Medicare? Hands shoot up through the entire room. I also ask the question, you know, if you were able to retain, say, 20% of that that you were able to identify, and by the way, that is one thing that seniors have, and that is some time to be able to do that kind of analysis. People get really excited about it, so we can drive health care.
The guy who wrote the report establishing the extent of the waste, fraud, and abuse, and Mr. Gingrich knocked it out. Are you aware that I spent 4 years on that and wrote the report that no one, not one single insurance company, not one person has questioned, where I established there's over $100 billion in waste, fraud, and abuse, but instead Mr. Gingrich and the Republicans, you talk about admiring the young revolutionaries, they in fact reduced the savings. I said, are you aware?
No, you asked about my admiring the young revolution.
I just remember a quote you saying you think they show great courage. Isn't that what you said, or it's not?
Who are these people you're talking about? Who's they?
The young 72 freshmen and the new freshmen. You were asking a question about Newt Gingrich and the freshmen.
Oh, I do. There's no question about it. They wanted to bring some reform to our government.
And they knocked out
Well, and I think Thomas Jefferson would be proud to know that his name could spark such debate in this particular race. Let's go to Jim Osmond, though, and ask him to throw the next issue on the table, if we are so brave.
Well, before I ask the question, I'd just like to clarify something and I know Republicans like to repeat this over and over and over again. The 1993 tax increase was not the largest in history. If you factor in inflation, and if you talk to mostly any economist, they'll tell you that the 1982 tax increase was the highest in history, and that was pushed through by Bob Dole.
Jim, I've heard other arguments, by the way, but so if you agreed to examine some of those arguments, I'd appreciate that as well.
The Wall Street Journal. I'll read the quote to you.
We could sit down and talk about it, but I wanted to present that point.
But there have been a lot of tax increases.
Well, let's just say this, and since 1985, Senator Biden has voted for $500 billion in tax increases. Does that add any clarity?
No. The reason that I brought it up is because it's very convenient to repeat things over and over that simply are not true, and that's the reason I brought it up. I will ask. Yes, I'm going to put an issue on the table. That one didn't work. Mr. Clatworthy, you have criticized Senator Biden for reinventing himself during this election. Some Democrats have said to me that they think that you have reinvented yourself, that you have hid your ties to the Christian coalition, that you've hidden some of your views on social issues. Could you clear the air and tell us what are your ties to the Christian coalition?
Well, I find that question interesting in the light of the fact that you just defended Senator Biden moments before.
I didn't defend Senator Biden. I was presenting the truth. Go ahead.
Oh, okay. Well, I just want to simply say that all kinds of people are supporting my campaign. We have people in our campaign offices that are extraordinary, great energy and commitment. They want to see some real fundamental change in America. We have people of faith. We have people who are pro-choice. We have people who are pro-life. They're working very diligently side by side in this very important effort.
So what are your ties? I mean, that didn't answer.
I don't have any ties. What kind of ties? Well, please
they have presented that you were a founder of the Delaware Christian Coalition.
Well, that is wrong. Nancy Kessler wrote that one time in the newspaper, and then she retracted it. And I believe Nancy said that she just assumed that that was correct.
Well, no, I didn't assume it. It was apparently almost everyone that we spoke to said it as a matter of fact, and there was never any question. I didn't
Nancy,
think
that's not the kind of journalism that you were brought up on.
Well, it probably isn't, but I didn't think you would have objected because I didn't think it was a criticism.
Okay.
Is it a criticism?
Well, apparently there seems to be a lot that try to portray Christian coalition types as extremists, and they're doing their very best to be able to include me in that group.
Let me tell you from my perspective, the Christian coalition is very much opposed to my candidacy. And the reason they are, and many of the same people come around the state, and they always hand me the Christian coalition scoreboard, Pat Robertson's, you know, who's good and who's bad. They tell me Mr. Clatworthy is 100%, and they say I'm 0 or close to 0 with them. And where we differ is on choice. He wants a constitutional amendment to eliminate abortion. He wants to do away with Roe v. Wade. He wants to do away with the assault weapons ban. He wants to do away with the Department of Education. He wants to do, right? They're all these, am I correct so far?
May I be clear?
Yeah, no, I'd like to know what your position is, because I'd like to hear him clarify.
I'd be glad to do that. First, Senator Biden, you were pro-life until 1988, is that correct?
No, my position has been consistent from the very beginning. I believe government should stay out. No constitutional amendment, no public funding.
You were not pro-life when you first went to the U.S. Senate?
Absolutely. I have not changed my vote one single time in voting over 200 times.
Well, that's
look at the record, Ray.
Well, I will, and I'll present it with you. But you know, I think.
Are you for a constitutional amendment to ban abortion?
That is not my first choice. I don't like
ultimately, if you had to vote in the Senate, I've had to vote 8 times in that. Would you vote for a constitutional?
My first choice would be to overturn Roe versus Wade. Please hear me now. Please hear. You have to have it in context. My first choice would be to overturn Roe versus Wade, simply because many pro-choice people...
How would you do that?
Please. Many pro-choice people understand it's bad law as well. When you put people on the bench, and many of the liberal...
But you're not on the bench. How would you do it?
Many people that have understood this as pro-choice people, that when you look to the 14th Amendment to find this penumbra...
If you don't mind my saying, how would you do it? You're not in the Supreme Court.
Well,
would you vote for a constitutional amendment? If you get elected, you're going to have to vote within 3-4 months of being down there. Will you vote for a constitutional amendment to ban abortion?
That is not the first choice.
I know, but you don't get to pick the choices, Ray. Someone puts it up and you have to vote.
If there were no other recourse, and we want to stop the kind of behavior we've had with 1.5 million abortions a year, if there were no other recourse, then I would.
Yes.
But I think there are other things.
For the assault weapon ban?
No, let me follow up. Now, what I think it's important to know is what your position on this is.
Sure.
You've gone there.
I voted over 200 times so far.
But you've also been a co-sponsor of the Freedom of Choice Act, which would allow abortions through the 3rd trimester.
That's not true.
That is true.
That is simply
You don't know
not
what you
true.
sponsored?
Look, I know what I sponsored.
You don't know that not only was Roe versus Wade codified, but Doe versus Bolton, which would allow...
Roe versus Wade was codified.
Was Doe versus Bolton? Was Doe versus Bolton codified?
No, 3rd trimester abortion. As a matter of fact, I co-sponsored the effort to stop partial birth abortions.
No. Now, what you did is you voted for the Boxer Amendment to first gut the...
I didn't gut it. Said if the woman's life was in danger, you wouldn't vote for that?
The woman's health was the Boxer Amendment.
You wouldn't have voted for that?
The woman's health. The woman's health
You wouldn't
has
vote
been...
for that?
Listen, please. A woman's health has been defined as mental anguish. Anybody who's going to have a 3rd trimester abortion, anybody who's going to have a partial birth abortion is going to have some mental anguish. Will you concede that?
Well, I may or may not
Well,
have met it.
you
But
know, the
that's, it's up
Congressional
to the
Quarterly,
doctor.
the nonpartisan Congressional Quarterly,
Please.
called the Freedom of Choice
this man
Act,
talk.
the Freedom of Choice Act, something that would allow abortion for any reason or
I
no
think
reason.
that we've clearly
But it
established that
does.
both of you have
Very
vastly
different
different
views on this.
viewpoints on this issue. I think that
I'm not so sure we answered the question, but
Did you expect
He's
one?
for a constitutional
we
amendment
did
abortion
answer the
if he has
question
to
that
last
originated over
recourse.
here, correct?
about the Delaware Christian Coalition, but are you offended that these Democrats are bringing into question your affiliation with the Christian Coalition?
No, I'm not. I'm proud to have all people that we have within our campaign.
But the Christian Coalition specifically?
Certainly, I'm delighted to have people who are willing to work for change in America. People of faith. Are you suggesting in your question
I'm not
that
suggesting
all
anything.
cannot
I'm
come
asking
to
you a
the?
question.
Let me
Go
be
ahead.
very clear on this. Let me be very clear on this. I believe in America that everybody should have a place at the table. I think it's very, very important.
does he.
People of faith believe. You know, in fact, I thought we had settled this question back in 1960 when John Kennedy was running for president, and many tried to use
Christian
his faith
Coalition
against
is not
him.
a religion, though, Ray. Is it? The Christian Coalition is a political organization.
It is many people like-minded that want to see
But it's
our
not a
nation
religion,
revert
is it?
to some traditional
But
values.
it's not a religion, is it?
It is not a religion.
Right, okay.
It is not a religion.
I'm going to ask us to table this aspect of the conversation in the interest of time so that we can get something else into the discussion here, because we are quickly seeing our time evaporate. Nancy, would you like to throw the next issue out?
Yes, one of the things that the Delaware poll the News Journal ran this week showed is a lot of people are concerned still about crime. It's one of the main issues in their minds. What is the role of the federal government in dealing with crime?
Currently, what it's doing is it's making things worse. Whenever we get the federal government involved, the federal government can't balance its budget. So how we can expect it to do things outside of its constitutional limits and somehow write these one-size-fits-all, unconstitutional crime bills that make it easier for the government to wiretap our homes and incubate crime. I mean, we didn't have the big drug problems that we have today. The reason why we have these drug problems today is because of the price supports that we have from the federal government. The federal government is actually ensuring huge profits for anyone who wants to sell drugs to kids and get them hooked.
This is a crazy idea of legalizing drugs.
I didn't say legalize
Or
it. Let's get the
even-
federal
even-
government out of it.
Even decriminalizing it.
Let's leave it up to the states. I don't think it's the federal
You don't
issue.
think there should be wiretaps out there? We have them for organized crime. Ray doesn't think we should have wiretaps for terrorists. You said we don't need anything new in the
If
terrorism
you could
bill.
guarantee who was a terrorist and who wasn't,
Let me
maybe.
be very clear on that.
I'd like to, because you
Joe,
said you're against the
you have
terrorism
a
bill.
marvelous way of speaking on my behalf, and I appreciate
Well, I'd like to
that.
hear what you say.
But let me just...
Are you against the terrorism bill?
Please, Joe, with all due respect.
Okay.
Well, my first choice with
don't
it...
get first choices when you're-
yes, you do. Yes,
No, you
you
gotta
do.
vote.
If you understand priorities, you do. If you understand priorities, you do.
If you're
Now, let's take
president,
the
Ray.
right... Now, let me tell you this, Joe. In 1986, Muammar Gaddafi was the greatest international terrorist that we had on the face of the earth. He sponsored more terrorism at that time than anybody else. Ronald Reagan handled it this way. He had a surgical strike that went in there and went after
Which I
Gaddafi.
supported.
You know, I think we got the wrong bedroom or something. Gaddafi was out of action for years. Terrorism went down by 90%. What we need to do now, what we need to do is this: is that when a sponsoring nation engages in training terrorists, we need to take tough and decisive action. I'm not willing to simply turn over our Fourth Amendment rights for any provocation. Now, with respect to...
By the way, we do it for organized crime, Ray. Why wouldn't
That's
you
a
do that?
mistake also.
Oh, you should
It is.
have.
No, I
Because-
think it's a
disagree.
mistake.
Mark,
Well,
we
let me
disagree on that.
explain myself.
We disagree on
I don't trust the government to decide what's organized crime and what isn't.
I
Maybe they'll
see.
decide the Libertarian Party is organized crime because we threaten your party, your parties,
I see.
who are locking out
Look,
Harry
it's
Brown
real
from the
simple.
debates.
For example, I wrote the terrorism bill that provides death penalty for terrorists. The guy's being tried in Oklahoma. If my bill hadn't passed and he gets convicted, he could not get the federal death penalty. Now, as I read your statements, I may be wrong. You said we need no more laws on terrorism. Isn't that what you said?
What we need is this. What we need is this. We have plenty of laws on the books for terrorism.
No, we don't, Ray.
We do, Joe.
Oh, okay.
Well, first, you have to very little of our terrorism is domestic. Very, very little. It
What
is.
about
It's
Oklahoma?
What about Oklahoma?
What about the
Who knows? Who knows?
You know, very little has been. You know, we have a Unabomber from time to time.
So we wait till another trade tower is blowing up?
But we don't give up our civil liberties. We then lose.
Amen.
We lose when we give up our civil
But you think we
liberties.
give up our civil liberties?
We've given up so
by-
many civil
Do you
liberties.
think we gave up our civil liberties by allowing multiple point wiretaps for organized crime?
But Joe,
Does
here's
that give you
here's
civil
what you're
liberties?
not catching. Here's what you're not grasping.
Last point on
most
this.
terrorism is sponsored abroad. Wiretap
Ray,
will not
I've been
do
on
one
that committee,
thing.
on the Intelligence Committee for 10 years.
And things have been going wrong, and they're poorly.
Internally, it's increasing as well.
I think at this point it might help the people in Delaware who are going to have to make a decision in November. If they could see how you see yourself as separate from the pack. So then why don't I ask each of you to describe for me specifically how is Joe Biden different from his opponents, and the same for each of you.
Well, look, I'm going to...
Let's not debate these answers, though. You will have your opportunity.
I will run the risk because I don't know all of Ray's positions. He hasn't stated them on every one of the issues, so I don't know all of his positions. But to the best of my knowledge, how I'm different than Ray Clatworthy and the good doctor. I'm different in several ways. I believe the only way you get things done in a country like this is if you get the middle together. If you notice, they seem to oppose my crime bill. Bill Roth and Mike Castle like my crime bill. They seem to want to repeal the assault weapons ban. Bill Roth and Mike Castle are for it. They seem to want to, are against the welfare position, the bill that Mike Castle and I introduced. Him in the House, me in the Senate. They seem to be in a position that seems to be, on almost every major issue of the day, inconsistent with where the mainstream of the Republican Party is, and I know the doctor's in disagreement with that, and we seem to be in disagreement in terms of the role of what the federal government can do. For example, my crime bill, it doesn't make any demands of the states. It just says, do you want a cop? If you want a cop, put in a one-page application. We'll send you the money to help you pay 70% of that cop. You don't have to have a cop if you don't want a cop. Nobody has to do that. In Delaware, we wanted 130 cops. It has impacted on making people safer in the state of Delaware. The reason the new prison system is being built, ask the people down there. $20 million out of the Biden crime bill guaranteed to help them build those prisons. So the point is, on almost all of the major issues, including Social Security, I don't want to privatize. He wants to privatize. He wants to eliminate Medicare. I don't want to eliminate Medicare. He wants to change Medicare in a way that seems consistent with mine, which is to pass the Biden bill, the Biden report that called for massive change in the fraud laws relative to Medicare. And on terrorists, we have a vastly different view on terrorism. I think if it's good enough for organized crime, it's good enough for some wacko militiaman up in Montana. I think it's good enough for the guy who did the pipe bomb, whoever it is. He doesn't want taggants in I assume you don't want taggants in black powder, right?
They certainly
And
will.
so,
Well, you asked a question.
well, so at any rate, the point is, I think there's fundamental disagreements. I think the views of Mr. Clatworthy, as I know the views in the House, seem consistent with the views of Mr. Gingrich, and unlike Castle, and seem consistent with the views of the new freshman, and inconsistent with the views of the bulk of, I shouldn't say the bulk of, with a significant minority of the Republicans and a significant number of Democrats.
Okay. Mr. Clatworthy.
Well, I hardly know where to start. Let me just say this, that first, with respect to the welfare bill, Senator Biden's comments immediately after the passage was, well, we'll have to go back and fix it. This happens to be an election.
Same thing Mike Castle said.
I need to let him have the floor,
Okay,
and we
sorry.
are almost out of time.
You know, and it just seems to me that we know in the past that Senator Biden has voted against such things as asking able-bodied people to work 10 hours a week. So we know where his heart is in the welfare, and I'll get you the documentation. You talked about Senator Roth and Congressman Castle. Well, the fact of the matter is that Senator Roth votes against you 80% of the time, and Congressman Castle about 70% of the
On those
time.
big issues.
And we talk about the cops as federalization of our criminal justice system. system. You know, the city of Dover, Delaware couldn't do it. Too many federal mandates, not enough flexibility built in the system all over America. You know, some communities may not need a police officer. They may need a new squad car. So we need the kind of flexibility that you can get, you know, when crime is fought at the local level. To think that crime can be fought the same way in South Central Los Angeles and Wilmington, Delaware, and Detroit, Michigan, that is nonsensical.
Is there a fundamental point where you see the two of you as being different?
Yes, I do, and that is this. I'm a small business person. I understand what it means to deal with limited resources. Senator Biden doesn't have, frankly, with all due respect, and I do like Joe, but he doesn't have real-world experience, and he's spent his entire adult life in Congress. And I've served on community hospital boards. I've been a small business person, YMCA boards, others. I understand what the community needs, and I also know that government cannot be run the way it is today. We need to start running government more like a business.
The clock is racing your way.
Okay, great. Thanks for this moment. First of all, notice that the Republicans and Democrats are very unwilling to acknowledge the failures of government, and there's a lot of them. The debt we didn't get a chance to talk about, which is fiscal child abuse. 15% of all federal spending is paying interest on the debt right now. That's a shame. I believe I'm trying to build the Libertarian Party because I believe these two old parties are far too entrenched to make the changes that we need. The Gingrich Revolution, or the failure of it, has proven that. How I differ from my opponents, God willing, I will live the majority of my life in the 21st century, and I want that to be a good one, and I see us going in the wrong direction. We are ignoring the U.S. Constitution when we should be listening to it now more than ever. Senator Biden talks about being concerned about organized crime. His prohibition is making organized crime richer than anything else possibly could. And finally, we are no longer innocent until proven guilty in this country thanks to Senator Biden's civil forfeiture. And that's a real shame. Learn about civil forfeiture. It's an organization called FEAR that I link to at my website at www.jones96.com.
Okay.
If you have access, check it out.
I knew the computer age would enter at some point. I want to thank all of you. This has been a lively time here for this forum.
And thanks for including the Libertarian candidate.
And thanks to our journalists as well for joining us for Delaware Candidates Forum. We appreciate what you were able to bring to the table, although I think that you would agree with me that in this particular instance, we were somewhat useless. But thanks to all of you. And I want to thank our viewers as well for joining us this evening as we were able to present you the issues that you're going to have to think about in November. Join us on 12 tonight, weeknights at 5:30. We're going to continue to watch the races, and we have more debates to come your way for Election 96. Good night, everybody.